Well, thank you so much for this kind introduction and for the invitation to have me talk to you tonight. I'm really pleased with the crowd here, and again, thank you so much for taking time out of your busy pre-holiday shopping season and joining us at the CCDG event. I wanted to thank for the invitation. I wanted to thank Ms. Sarah Plowman for recruiting me to talk here tonight. As Amy mentioned, I'm going to talk about glyphosate. The topic is quite timely, and it's surrounded by a bit of controversy. So bear with me here. I am not here to persuade anybody of one way or another. I'm here to state facts, and I will leave the facts interpretation to all of you to really make your minds about what you think about glyphosate. But first of all, I wanted to highlight the analytical aspect of that, and that's exactly what we're here for. So let me start with that. Just very quickly, I'm from Now Foods, and to those who don't know about Now Foods, although we are getting more and more popular, it's a dietary supplement manufacturer. We manufacture dietary supplements, sports nutrition products, personal care items. You can find us pretty much everywhere. We have, I believe, over 2,000 SKUs across different products, which is quite impressive. It keeps us very, very busy. So I could talk about glyphosate probably through the night. It's a very broad subject, but I wanted to shorten that for the sake of tonight's meeting. So just very quickly, the outline of my presentation. I will go through a glyphosate review, to briefly describe what a glyphosate is, although I'm pretty sure majority of people are familiar with what it is. Mechanism of action, a bit of a history. I say a bit of a history. I put a little bit more than I wish, but I just could not resist. There's just so much about it. I'm going to go through very briefly about a review of glyphosate potential carcinogenic effect and other health effects that could be due to glyphosate exposure. I'll dig a little bit into general public's concern surrounding glyphosate's exposure. And then how do we control glyphosate exposure? How do we control glyphosate in our food supply? And then I'll dive into the methodologies, the popular methods that are being used for glyphosate analysis, and then what works for us at Now Foods, since the method has been implemented as an in-house testing methodology. I'll go a little bit about method validation, which is in process, and interpretation of the glyphosate residue levels that are commonly found, and what should we do about it, because there's really not that much out there as far as clean-cut regulatory limits. And then I'll end up with a brief summary. All right. I need to see what I'm talking about on the screen. So glyphosate is the active ingredient in Roundup. Everybody knows that. I'm pretty sure everyone has a bottle of glyphosate in the garage and they're using that on weeds. I know I do. It is a non-selective broad-spectrum phosphomethyl amino acid, in this case glycine herbicide, used to control weeds in agricultural and non-agricultural settings. It is not only used in agriculture, like I said, a lot of people are using it at home to control the weeds in our driveways. So what is the mechanism of action of this particular compound? So glyphosate acts by inhibiting the 5-endyl-pyruvyl shikimate phosphate synthase. So by doing that, by affecting this pathway, it disables the production of aromatic amino acids such as phenylalanine, tyrosine, and tryptophan in plants. And basically, by doing so, it causes the plant death. It doesn't only work on plants, it also works on bacteria and fungi, which is a little bit concerning because majority of people are under the assumption that glyphosate only works on plants, which is not really true. So a little bit of a background. I've learned myself that the glyphosate was not an herbicide from the very beginning. So in 1961, it was patented as a descaling and chelating agent by Stauffer Chemical Company. So it worked really well on cleaning those pipes out of mineral residues, and that's how it came about. And the workers noticed that by dumping the waste from descaling of those pipes, all the vegetation just died. So they started looking closer into why all those plants that the waste is being poured on are dying. And in 1970, glyphosate was actually discovered as an herbicide by Monsanto scientist John France, and it was patented as an herbicide. So in 1974, Monsanto brought glyphosate to market, so it was a registered herbicide allowed to be used on weeds. And they brought it to market under the name of Roundup. Not even a decade later, they started already working on Roundup-ready genetically modified crops. So you can see what I'm going with it. In 1985, following a few toxicological studies, the EPA classified glyphosate as Class C carcinogen, which has suggestive evidence of carcinogenic potential, according to the EPA. So there were some mice that grew some tumors. It was not really clear why, but as a precaution, and based on that particular evidence, it was classified as such. However, Monsanto thought otherwise. So in 1985, that same year, they tried to persuade the US EPA that glyphosate was not a possible human carcinogen. So following additional rat carcinogenicity studies, a second peer-reviewed pre-review was conducted in 1991 by the agency's carcinogenicity peer review committee, that's a mouthful, and a conclusion was made of evidence of non-carcinogenicity to humans based upon the lack of evidence for carcinogenicity in mice and rats. I really don't think we can compare mice and rats to the potential carcinogenicity in humans, but that was the conclusion that was made. So in March of 2015, the International Agency for Research on Cancer, which is a subdivision of the World Health Organization, determined that glyphosate was probable carcinogen. So that was done on a smaller set of data, smaller set of studies, which showed the adverse effects of glyphosate. And in November of 2015, the European Food Safety Authority determined that glyphosate was unlikely to pose carcinogenic hazard to humans. And in May of 2016, the Joint Food and Agricultural Organization with WHO meeting on pesticide residues concluded that glyphosate was unlikely to pose carcinogenic risk to humans from exposure through diet. So which one is it? Is it carcinogenic or it's not carcinogenic? We get a little bit of a contradiction here. Just to keep in mind that majority of those non-carcinogenic conclusions were made based on the same data set, the same studies that were evaluated by different agencies. So recent regulatory review, we all know that glyphosate is in the news. So that was also brought up to the EPA's attention. And glyphosate was actually due for renewal of its registration. And in April 23rd of 2018, the EPA's Office of Chemical Safety and Pollution Prevention published a memorandum which was titled Glyphosate Response to Comments on the Human Health Draft Risk Assessment. So once again, that was in response to the concerns. In the memorandum includes glyphosate cancer assessment, toxicological studies, evaluation of glyphosate as endocrine disruptor, effect on children, accumulation in tissue and milk, disruption of gut microbiome, metal chelation, and non-cancer disease probability. So through all of those little sections, if you read through that memorandum, the conclusion is always that no evidence was found of any adverse effect of glyphosate on human health. Which, once again, that was based on a very limited toxicological study set, and the reason why everything was deemed not to cause any health issues because of lack of statistical difference between those studies. So bottom line is that EPA still thinks that there's no adverse effects. However, general public is still concerned. People are concerned with the glyphosate in their food, and rightfully so, because the use of glyphosate have skyrocketed over the decades. So from about 6 to 8 million tons used worldwide in agriculture, now we're pushing 300 million tons of use, which I would say it's slightly more. So what is the issue, and why are we really concerned with glyphosate? As I mentioned, the volume of glyphosate-based herbicides, because Roundup is not the only product that is using glyphosate in its formulation, the volume has increased over 100-fold. The initial industry toxicity testing suggested that glyphosate-based herbicides posed relatively low risk to non-targeted species, including mammals, leading regulatory authorities worldwide to set high acceptable exposure limits. And some animal and epidemiology studies were published in the last decades. Once again, they were very limited, and it seems like they need a fresh look on glyphosate toxicity. So the worldwide increased use of those glyphosate-based herbicides is contaminating drinking water sources, because we see glyphosate present in water. Precipitation, so you can see it in falling rain, snow, so on and so forth. Air, especially where glyphosate is being applied in the agricultural regions. The half-life of glyphosate, and we've heard it all, that it's really short, it's gonna degrade, we're not gonna see any residues, is actually longer than we had thought before. Glyphosate and its metabolites are wildly present in the global soybean supply. And human exposure, because of all of that, to glyphosate-based herbicides is rising. And now that the WHO and California Prop 65 identified glyphosate as a probable carcinogen, people are concerned. There's a large body of evidence stating that glyphosate has adverse effects on human health. And that is not only based on the carcinogenicity of glyphosate. There's been a lot of talks about carcinogenicity, but that is not the only thing that people are really concerned with. So a couple of really good review articles that have been published in the recent years by Anthony Samuel and Stephanie Sanoff. They've published, it's a really nice summary if you're interested in looking into that, diving into the issue of glyphosate exposure and the health adverse effects of glyphosate if it comes to cancer, if it comes to amino acid analog, because there is a proposed pathway, because glyphosate is essentially a glycine amino acid with an adduct on it, that it may actually play a role in protein production instead of glycine. And if that is true, that can be very, very catastrophic. And that can cause so many different health issues that are way outside of our scope of understanding of really how glyphosate can affect human health. They also have a really good article on celiac sprue and gluten intolerance, and we know virtually every other American has gluten intolerance. It's not only popular, people are having issues, and it's contributed to something, and there's a really nice explanation, scientific explanation of what could be the pathway of glyphosate actually affecting those health aspects. And they also talk about the suppression of cytochrome P450 enzymes in the amino acid biosynthesis by gut microbiome. And again, glyphosate is supposed to work only on plants. Well, no, it's affecting the microbiota as well. So if we know we're all exposed to it, and if we know that it could affect our health, because none of the regulatory agencies have clearly stated that it is not a carcinogen, that it's not a health-affecting compound. It's probable. So if I will take the probable with a grain of salt, right? I will prevent the exposure to the extent possible. So what can we do as manufacturers to control the glyphosate pollution in our food supply? Because that's what we want to do. If glyphosate is applied worldwide, what can we do to control it, not to expose our customers to the glyphosate pollution? So as manufacturers, we can control the ingredients that we use in our manufacturing process. We enforce the non-GMO ingredients production and use, which means that it's not genetically modified to be glyphosate resistant. We implement routine monitoring of our ingredients and push back on the ingredients that are clearly contaminated with glyphosate. We basically send them back to the suppliers. And we need to also reinforce the implementation of stricter regulatory limits if it comes to glyphosate-based herbicides in food and water. So just a quick glimpse, how much glyphosate is too much. In California, proposed limit is 1.1 milligram. EPA allows 140 milligrams. And the Environmental Working Group recommends 0.1 milligram. I don't know if anybody's familiar with the Environmental Working Group, but it's a really nice resource also. So as we dive into the ingredient testing on a manufacturer level, having a really strong supplier qualification program allows us as manufacturers to source better ingredients, the ingredient as opposed to finished product testing prevents use of that contaminated ingredient and then having it in a finished product at the very beginning of the manufacturing process. We're protecting ourselves by not using something that is not good and then not chasing our tail trying to find out where it came from. And also the use of analytical methods that are fit for purpose for the determination of glyphosate-based herbicides in the tested ingredients. But for those who have ever tried glyphosate analysis, you probably know that this is a very challenging determination. At Now Foods, we've been working on this methodology for the past, I would say, about 2 years. When the topic became hot, when we got questions from our customers asking us whether we test for glyphosate in our products, we started developing a methodology, and it was not easy because, well, we thought it's just a small molecule. We're just going to put it on a C18 column, detect it with mass spec, and off we go. Well, it's a little bit more challenging than that. So glyphosate and its biodegradation product, AMPA, which we're also looking at, are probably one of the most difficult molecules to analyze for because of their polarity. The extraction, the chromatographic retention have been, at least for us, very difficult to achieve. Most methods are utilizing derivatization to increase the hydrophobicity of the molecule. But that does not always work well because it's matrix dependent, and also using derivatization, you're limiting yourself to look at just a small handful of polar pesticides if you want to expand your scope. So there's a lot of challenges associated with that particular determination. So when we started looking at the ways of testing for glyphosate, we came across a bunch of different methodologies describing different ways of preparing samples and analyzing them by different techniques. The polarity of glyphosate and the metabolites, just like I mentioned before, created a tremendous challenge if it comes to chromatographic separation. But also the ability of glyphosate to form complexes with metal complicated the process even further, because as we learned later, losing sensitivity using certain setups, we needed to passivate our HPLCs in order to regain that sensitivity. So again, just pulling a paper out of a journal article was really not a solution, because what worked for other people did not work for us. And if we achieved a really nice separation of the polar pesticides in the standard, that was not the case when we moved into a matrix. So if it comes to instrumentation choices for glyphosate analysis, I came across very wide array of instrumentation that is being commonly used, from HPLC coupled to fluorescence, ultraviolet, electrochemical detection, mass spectrometry, tandem mass spectrometry, IC, GC, ELISA, and more. I was able to find more techniques that are utilized for glyphosate analysis. We have tried most of them, and I believe still the AOAC official method is GC-based. As a side note, there's a working group at the NACRU. So if you are familiar with the NACRW group, We have created a working group on glyphosate method development, validation, and implementation to come up with a different way of doing things as opposed to with the GC. So if anybody would like more information, you can check that out at the NACRO meeting. Anyway, trying different things, mostly failures. We have discovered that the ICMS is probably the most robust way of looking at polar pesticides. And I'm not here to advertise anything. This is just something that worked for us. We have tried coupling HPLCs with a tandem mass spectrometry, and it worked for a while. And then we found out that we were losing progressively sensitivity because of the glyphosate's affinity towards metal. And we had to passivate the system to get back into the analysis mode. So we have tried the ICMS with peak tubing, so we didn't really have to worry about any metal contact surfaces, and it worked. So this is basically what we ended up developing our methodology based off of. And also the use of suppressed conductivity through IC eliminates the introduction of any additives, any salts into the mass spec, which we were quite pleased with, because the longer the mass spec runs without cleaning, the happier we are. If it comes to column selection, we probably tried everything that was published, described, suggested by others, with mixed success. So the high polarity of glyphosate, again, that restricts the application of a conventional C18 unless you derivatize it. There's endless number of publications listing anion exchange columns used with weakly acidic mobile phases, helic column, hypercarb. There's a lot out there, but again, this did not work for the matrices that we were trying to address. Once again, majority of the columns of choice gave us a really nice separation in a standard mix. The moment we moved to a matrix and introduced some interferences, we could not tell what's what. If it comes to sample preparation, there's still quite a bit out there. However, everything oscillates around the same sample prep procedure. Glyphosate is very polar, very soluble in water, non-soluble in organic solvents, so naturally we have to move with the water extraction from the matrix. Majority of applications are using the QPPE method for extraction of polar pesticides from samples of plant and animal origin. So it's a method to be used on pesticide sample preparation that Catchers does not work on. And Catchers doesn't work on glyphosate. So depending on the nature of the matrix, if we're dealing with water or something really simple, a simple extraction will work. But if we're dealing with a very heavy matrix, we have to use some sort of sample cleanup procedure in a form of SPE, ultracentrifugation for protein, heavy samples, those freeze crashes work, filtration or what have you. So this is what we use at now. And again, 2 years down the road, something that we have tried and it worked internally. I'm not saying you have to use it. If your method works for your matrix and your application, great. But this is what we use. We actually we utilize the ion exchange column with the IC and couple it with the tandem mass spec. So very briefly, these are our IC conditions that work well for the separation of glyphosate and metabolite species. So with the ion exchange column, we're using potassium hydroxide gradient, and that has been optimized, once again, not only for standards, but the matrices that we look at. And again, if anybody's interested in this, I believe this is going to be posted as well. So in terms of sample preparation, this is the workflow that we follow for most. We take 1 gram of a sample and extract it with a 50-50 methanol water, and you'll see a little bit later. And this is one of the examples of the samples that we test. It's a whey protein isolate. It's a protein-heavy sample, so we have to crash some of that protein before putting it in the vial. So we just put it on a high-speed vortex, apply SPE sample cleanup. So this is just a simple pass-through cleanup. Centrifuge the sample, dilute the sample with water, and then just put it on an instrument. So quite simple. There's really nothing to it. So what does the chromatography look like? I was always super psyched about looking at the chromatography because here's the thing. If we got glyphosate looking nice, AMPA always tailed. If we got AMPA looking nice, glyphosate always tailed. We could not find that happy medium to accommodate both of them, and this is the example where we got both of them. So what we're looking at is glyphosate, AMPA, and their acetylated forms. So per EU, we are required to report glyphosate as a sum of glyphosate, AMPA, and their acetylated forms. So this is in our standard mix, so it looks good. The question is, how does it look in a matrix? Because that was always the issue. Once we got it looking nice in the standard, matrix was always a hot mess. So this is glyphosate spiked in pea protein. Protein-heavy matrix, but we still got a really, really good peak shape and a separation. And the nice thing about this way of doing it, what we had noticed with different techniques, different columns, was that they were very prone to retention time shifts under different matrix conditions. So once glyphosate was put in a different matrix, retention time would shift, sometimes way outside of our window, and we had to look for it and then use internal standard correction, so on and so forth. In this particular case, we don't get matrix shift. So this method, I should have said, is validated according to the USP 1221 guidelines. And the tested parameters include the determination of LOD, LOQ, repeatability, accuracy, specificity, and system suitability. And the matrices evaluated that we have started with, we focused on the matrices that on the products that come from agriculture. I know there's a lot of companies that test other things, but from my perspective, these are the high-risk items that we carry. So we decided to focus on those first. The scope is going to be expanded to others, but this is what we started with. So as I mentioned before, 4 compounds were evaluated, and they included glyphosate, N-acetyl glyphosate, AMPA, and N-acetyl AMPA. So we use matrix matched calibration curves and the quantitation using standard addition to eliminate the use of internal standard. And I got some questions regarding the ditching the internal standards. The problem is that the internal standards are not available for all the compounds we were looking at. So we could not apply the same correction because they don't respond exactly the same way, and we were not able to cross-use internal standards across different compounds. So what we found out worked really well is using the standard addition. So we basically process the standards as samples, and then once everything is processed the same way, automatically everything is normalized. So that worked really well. I know there's a couple of other groups that are utilizing the same approach. Dr. Amadeo from Brazil, he uses exactly the same approach. And also this is a cost-saving aspect from the company standpoint, so we're saving time and money doing that. So as a continuation to our results, the methods, limits of detection and quantitation allow to see glyphosate well below the most strict regulatory limits, and we're talking about the 10 ppb, most stringent that we could find limit. So in all the matrices that were evaluated, we can get down to 0.1 ppb detection limit, which I think is very impressive because that allows us not only to see down to low levels, but also if the need arises to dilute the sample further to mitigate some of the matrix interferences that we may see and still see glyphosate quite sufficiently. So we've looked at whey protein, soy protein, pea protein, a lot of plant proteins, popcorn, and oats. So spike recoveries for all matrices that were tested for glyphosate, because that's what we started with, were in the range of 87 to 121% with the RSDs below 5%. Specificity was evaluated to ensure no matrix interferences were present in the matrix blank, and the validation is still ongoing to incorporate more parameters and other than glyphosate analytes, so we still have to target AMPA, anacetyl AMPA, and anacetyl glyphosate. And the reason why we're doing this upfront validation is to cover our ifs. What if we see something that we don't know? And again, Now Foods operates under CGMP rules, so we have to have our methods validated. That's why we have a whole team designated for that work. And doing this upfront really eliminates all those questions later down the road. So this method allows us not only to determine glyphosate in different products down to low levels, but it also enables us to add down the road other polar pesticides. And we have added MPPA and glufosinate to this particular screen. We can definitely target more as the need arises to test for more polar pesticides within the company's scope. But what do we do with those numbers? We get a number, but what does that mean? Oftentimes we get questions, well, at which point would you reject a material if you saw glyphosate in? And then we look at those regulatory limits and they are just high. And we cannot possibly release oats that have thousands of ppms of glyphosate in, and that's what the regulatory limits are. Luckily, other countries are coming out with more stringent limits, and because Now Foods is actually distributes products across the whole world, we have to obey down to the lowest regulatory limits worldwide, which is a nice thing. But the US EPA limit is 1.75 milligram per kilogram of body weight per day. The EU is a little bit lower at 0.3 milligram per kilogram per day. And the typical maximum residual level for glyphosate is between 0.05 and 500 milligrams per kilogram. So we tend to stay on the lower end. And this is something that we started practicing and looking into, as opposed to saying, it's okay, it's below the regulatory limits, we can let it go. Although the 40 CFR, which as a manufacturers, we could make it our guide, allows anywhere between 0.1 milligram per kilogram in corn and 100 milligrams per kilogram in cereal, which is oats and other cereals. So we were trying to understand what baseline levels are there across the market. We wanted to understand what glyphosate levels are present in products that are similar to those sold by Now Food. So we know that with the increased use of glyphosate, there is a baseline level. We can see it almost in everything. But we wanted to identify what level is acceptable, what level is really a baseline for any particular product that we would be looking at. So Ken, one of our scientists, he did a little bit of a market research to look at where are we in comparison to other products. And we saw different numbers. So you can take a look at what we were able to find. So typically protein powders, what we would expect, would not carry a large glyphosate residue. But if we look at oats, popcorn, hemp protein, plant protein, pea protein, those have various values of glyphosate residue. And that's quite concerning. And there's a little, I would say, fun fact I can share with you in regards to pea protein. So we have heard from one of the organizations that are responsible for monitoring products in the marketplace, and they are focused on pea protein. And why pea protein? Pea protein is a very popular product now for all the vegetarian/vegan users that don't want to use whey protein. And they tested the highest sellers on Amazon. So they pulled the highest seller pea protein and tested them on Amazon. And what do you know? All of them came out with glyphosate residues, some at really, really high levels. So the company started looking into the reasons. Why? Is it the glyphosate that the pea is desiccated on? Is it treated before harvest? So as they started looking into the processing, and what they found out was that the pea, before it went into manufacturing of the protein, was clean. But then everything was shipped to China and came back with high glyphosate residues. So this is an ongoing project that they are focusing on and trying to find out at which point glyphosate gets introduced into the organic pea protein. But that's just a side note. I thought it was really interesting. Like, wow, where's it coming from? So because various maximum residue levels are established worldwide in various commodities, we really don't have those clearly defined limits that we can use to interpret our results. And although high glyphosate limits are still accepted in the US, companies should implement the most strict global limits when evaluating supply chain, and that's exactly what we do. And you may see those glyphosate-free claims. This is something that we will never go for because glyphosate-free claim is strictly dependent on the analytical capabilities of the laboratory that is actually doing those testing. Because you can't see it, it doesn't mean that it's not there. Because we are working in a quite strict quality control environment, and this is a residue analysis, and residue analyses are not always black and white. We have to be able to identify those process changes and planned deviations, what we call them, and define them in our quality control process. It is not easy because for anybody that is working in a CGMP environment, any change is not welcomed. But as long as we define the acceptance criteria, and that's why, once again, we're going through the validation process to define those acceptance criteria up front to make sure that we have less of those planned deviations. And again, we have a challenge of a comprehensive data review and approval process to design. So once again, every analysis as comprehensive as this one, or even more, we do pesticide residue analysis, that has to be wrapped in our quality control system. So in summary, since the introduction of glyphosate, its use drastically increased worldwide. And although per the US EPA, glyphosate does not pose a health hazard to humans or animals, a growing body of recent studies suggest otherwise. Production of glyphosate in the food supply can happen by implementation of strict monitoring program at the manufacturer level, and fit-for-purpose sensitive methods are necessary for accurate determination of glyphosate and other polar pesticides in products. Sometimes we get the question why we don't test glyphosate in the finished product, as some companies do. And once again, we would rather address that at the ingredient level as opposed to finished product level, where the glyphosate residue could be diluted with other constituents in the finished product. So I just wanted to quickly acknowledge Ken Bolda. Ken is in the audience. He is the lead scientist behind all this work that I just presented. Our VP, Aaron Seacrest, for letting me share this knowledge with you, and my boss, Alan LeFew. And of course, CCDG for inviting me to share my experience with glyphosate today.